Hello, today I'm going to talk to you about Exposure by Wilfred Owen. It really is one of my favourite poems from the cluster, and that's just because it links to so many things. Now I'm going to start off with the context first of all, and I've included a quote. As you can see, my subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. This quotation from Wilfred Owen is about what inspired him to start writing poems in the First World War. Now he talks about the subject being war and the pity of war being very important to him, because Wilfred Owen was very outspoken against war and against the way the war was being run, the way the war was being presented. However, he saw it as his duty to be a soldier, and he saw that as a duty because of his fellow soldiers, not necessarily because of this idea of propaganda of the war being glorious and wonderful. So I've included a letter that was to his mother, so Susan Owen, on the 4th of February 1917. Now, what he's talking about here is very important, because he's actually talking about what inspired Exposure. So I have no mind to describe all the horrors of this last tour, but it was almost worse than the first, because in this place my platoon had no dugouts, but had to lie in the snow under the deadly wind. By day it was impossible to stand up or even to crawl about, because we were behind only a little up ridge screening us from the Boches, which is slang for Germans, periscope, which means they could be killed if they stood up. Now, he also talks about dehydration being a problem in the next paragraph. You can obviously pause this and read this all the way through. They were unable to melt the ice that was in their water cans, so they were very dehydrated, lying down in the snow. He thinks it's quite shocking that they didn't all die of the cold. In fact, he says only one of my party actually froze to death before he got back. And I think it's interesting there that he sort of talks about only one and being quite shocked, because I think he thought there would be a lot more. He also talks about, I had no real casualties from shelling, though for 10 minutes every hour whiz bangs fell a few yards short of us, so those are again bombs. Showers of soil rained on us, but no fragments of shell could find us. So that's the kind of idea of nothing happened. And then we've got the phrase, we were marooned in a frozen desert, which shows that isolation that he feels. Now, Exposure, that's a really important part of Exposure, because what they were actually doing was lying in the snow and keeping watch. And that was really difficult for them to do. There's no comfort there. And they're really alone with their thoughts, and that's what comes through in Exposure. Now, if you're going to be writing any kind of flashcards for context for Exposure, I've got something here that I think will be of use to you. So these are all the points that I would use for context for Exposure. So Owen was outspoken about his negative views on war. Owen discusses the terrible conditions soldiers faced. He is contrasting the propaganda at the time that portrayed war as glorious and death as heroic. Owen often turned his focus to the futility of war, which is war as a pointless waste of life. And these men froze to death or risked their lives for very little gain, which is definitely shown in But Nothing Happens. So if you are doing flashcards, pause and start writing some of those points out for yourself. I'm going to move on to some quotations here. So these are quotations that will support your context. You shouldn't be giving any long context analysis until you have actually done some AO2, so some language analysis. So your context and your analysis should all be sort of holding hands. So everything you say for context should link to a point from the poem. So we're going to go through those points now. So we're going to just have a look at this propaganda poster, this kind of idea of sending these men off for this glorious, wonderful purpose and to save the country. Now, then we're going to come to our first quotation, our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knive us. So the opening line personifies nature immediately as the enemy. Owen still uses warlike imagery, but makes it clear he is removing us from the battle with the Germans. The battle is with the elements. So obviously we've got the adjective merciless in there, which means he is portraying nature as very ruthless, very brutal. You have the personification, which is also really important. But again, you're tying this into the fact that war was not this glorious, heroic battle, that they were actually battling the elements at this point in time. So that's what will tie in with AO3. Then we have our next quotation, but nothing happens. So this is a refrain, which is a repeated line in the poem. And this is an anticlimax where we build up to something, but nothing really happens. So we think we're getting to a climax, but nothing happens. And this is one way Owen is proving their deaths were pointless. It's also about the men anticipating, which means expecting something, but instead they're just relentlessly attacked by nature. So they keep expecting something to happen, but nothing is actually happening. Then we have, what are we doing here? Is it that we are dying? Now sometimes Owen is changing the refrain. So he was using but nothing happens a lot, and now he's using these. So what are we doing here, and is it that we are dying? Now, notably, he's doing this with two rhetorical questions, because that's to create a sense of confusion. It's meant to show the difficulty of the soldiers, because they're uncertain, they're unprepared, they do not know what's coming next. And they're even confused as to whether or not they're living or dying at this point, because they're so disoriented from war. So we move on to shutters and doors all closed. On us, the doors are closed. So we've got closed doors, which often symbolise a loss of opportunity. So, for example, you might say the door to opportunity is shut. So it's a very famous image for opportunity. And it does show the waste of life and the waste of youth, because when they think about going home, they realise those doors are closed to them. It could alternatively show how isolated they are from home now. They don't feel connected to it anymore. It feels like there is no way back for them. They're lost to war. He even says, the innocent mice rejoice, the house is theirs now. And when he talks about rodents having more right around the home than these men do, it really does show that isolation from their homes. Then we're up to love of God seems dying. So this is another change in the refrain. So he's changed again from but nothing happens. And it shows how abandoned they feel. We know that God is benevolent. He's meant to love all, but it feels like he has forgotten them in war. It shows the hopeless tone of the poem as Owen only sees the inevitable death coming for them. So he's no longer finding that comfort in faith and religion that a lot of people would find. He actually looks at God as forgetting the sort of hell that is war. We move on to Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army. So we've got more personification of nature here, which again shows the power of nature over these men and the way it has this incredible ability to affect them and affect their lives. Now, dawn is normally symbolic of new beginnings, as it's a new day, but each new day brings new misery at war. Personifying nature as the enemy also shows the power of nature and the soldiers as powerless and helpless victims when they are put up against nature, because they cannot overcome something so powerful and so eternal like nature. He even calls it God's invincible spring, and obviously invincible means it can never be defeated. So he does feel completely and utterly weak in comparison to nature. Then we've got far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. Another key quotation. So Owen is going against the typical views of propaganda, that war is all about bravery and action. He shows that men often wait around with nothing to focus on except the threats around them. Nature, bullets, shells. The men seem to be waiting around, thinking about the dangers that surround them. And when he talks about it as a rumour, almost like it's not really real, it's not really there, it's not really tangible, he says far off and dull as well, to create this sense that they're so far removed from the action And again, it just adds that idea of pointlessness, futility. Why are we even here? We're not actually accomplishing anything by being here. And that's what really comes through with exposure. This frost will fasten on this mud and us. So we're comparing the effects of the frost on humans and on mud, which shows that the humans were dehumanized. They had the same fate as the mud. So nature doesn't discriminate. It's going to freeze everything in its path, presenting it as very ruthless. It also shows the soldiers were left to die with no hope of safety. They were treated like mud, like dirt. They were left there with nothing else. So that's really interesting from Owen to sort of almost compare the men to mud, as if they are nothing, as if they are wasted. And then we've got the pararhyme of silent, salient, nervous, us. It goes through the entire poem. Pararhyme is when Owen changes the vowel sounds. So it's similar to a half rhyme, and Owen is creating a sense of unease or dissonance, which is a lack of harmony. The pararhyme reflects the unpredictable nature of war and the lack of harmony. So everything feels like it's going to rhyme, but it doesn't quite rhyme. There's something corrupt about the rhyme scheme, something different, something strange. And that's by changing the vowel sounds. So everything feels like a half rhyme. It's not quite right. So it's another way Owen is conveying his idea that war is not glorious and all it's made out to be by the media and propaganda. War is actually corrupt and there's something wrong with it. And just a top tip, structural analysis is better when there's a clear purpose, for example, a rhyme scheme. So don't comment on punctuation in a poem just to desperately fit something in about structure. Your examiner will see through that. It's not going to get you high marks like you think it is. We'd rather see a lot of language analysis as your teacher, and we would rather see a lot of good analysis, be it for structure or language. So back to the reason I think Exposure is such a good poem to learn and such a core poem for power and conflict. And that's because it links to so many poems. The Prelude and Storm on the Island, because again, it's the power of nature over man. It links to War Photographer, the effects of conflict and signs of hopelessness. Remains, the effects of conflict and the mental anguish of the soldiers. Bayonet Charge, the effects of conflict and soldiers anticipating death. Charge of the Light Brigade, again the effects of conflict and soldiers anticipating death. It links to the Emigre, effects of conflict. Kamikaze, effects of conflict and questioning conflict and propaganda, because that's clear from Kamikaze. And Poppies, the effects of conflict and loss, grief and death. So it really is a key poem. It's something that you can compare to so many poems in the cluster. And it's a really easy one to just keep in your mind. So every time one of these poems comes up as a potential named poem, so if you get Storm on the Island or the Emigre, for example, you can always link them to Exposure. So thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and comment if there's anything you would like me to go over.